The words frightened to death are used often. Here are 10 cases of people who were quite literally frightened to death. The Hammersmith Ghost is one of the most well-known and well-documented deaths that was, if indirectly, attributable to a specter. In the early 19th century, tales circulated in West London's Hammersmith district of a scary apparition haunting one of the area's graveyards. Locals reported witnessing a white figure with a glass eye and horns emerge from the eerie shadows, crying, groaning, and writhing in front of visitors. After a pregnant woman claimed to have been physically attacked and a wagon driver abandoned his passengers and horse. In fear at the sight of the specter, word spread that the ghost could be that of a man who had recently committed suicide before being buried in the churchyard's consecrated ground. The reports were taken so seriously that armed patrols were dispatched to apprehend the ghost, and it wasn't long before one of them, an excise officer named Smith, came face to face with it. Fearing that he would become the next victim, he fired a shot from his gun after demanding to know the identity of the apparition and obtaining no response. Unfortunately, there was no ghost in the graveyard. Instead, the victim, Thomas Millwood, was a man, a plasterer dressed in the white uniform of his trade. The ensuing murder trial was one of the most extraordinary in history, with Smith eventually being sentenced to death, though this was later converted to hard labor due to a royal pardon. However, Thomas Millwood's spirit was not at peace. His body was taken to the Black Lion public house the day after he was killed, and it is said that he still haunts the premises, speaking in clients' ears, slamming on walls, and making loud footsteps across the bar area. After all, Thomas Millwood may have genuinely become the Hammersmith Ghost. During the early 1920s, the pharaoh Tutankhamun's tomb was discovered in the Valley of the Kings, an ancient Egyptian burial site dating back to the 16th century BC. The virtually undisturbed tomb was uncovered by Howard Carter, a British archaeologist, together with the 5th Earl of Carnarvon. The amazing Hall of Finds would become a worldwide media sensation. However, the press also seized on the stories which said a curse would fall on anybody who desecrated the pharaoh's tomb. And shortly after, Lord Carnarvon himself met an untimely death in Cairo. Arthur Conan Doyle, famed Sherlock Holmes creator, fueled the fires of the rumor mill by telling the press that it was an evil spirit which had been summoned by ancient Egyptian priests to protect their pharaoh in death, which could have killed Carnarvon. While all of this speculation may have died down over time, the following years witnessed the deaths of a number of people who had been part of the team that had discovered the tomb, or who had been engaged in some way with the proceedings. Arthur Mace, a member of the excavation team who was killed by arsenic in 1928. Richard Bethel, Howard Carter's secretary, who was allegedly smothered to death in his sleep in 1929. And Sir Archibald Douglas Reed, who was responsible for x-raying the pharaoh's mummy and died mysteriously in 1924, were among those who died. Could an ancient Egyptian ghost be to blame? Alcatraz is widely regarded as one of the most haunted places in the United States, yet no portion of the legendary island jail has been associated with more terrible ghost stories than the cells in D Block. The hole refers to a section of D Block, and its cells were utilized for solitary confinement. The cells had simply a sink, a toilet, and a weak light bulb that the guards controlled. Inmates slept on mattresses that were removed during the day. There were no reading materials permitted, leaving convicts with nothing but suffocating boredom. The Oriental, the hole's penultimate cell, was essentially a steel sensory deprivation chamber with only a hole at the bottom for excrement. During the 1940s, there were numerous sightings of a ghostly man dressed in late 19th century prison garb patrolling the hole. However, the apparition could be to blame for a mysterious death of a prisoner. Shortly after being put in a hole cell, the inmate began shouting that there was someone trapped inside with him who had glowing eyes. The guards ignored him as he screamed late into the night before falling silent. The guards discovered the inmate had been strangled to death the next day, his handprints on his throat vivid and fresh. while others claim that one of the guards finally cracked and took the last step to halt the man's screams. A thorough inquiry revealed no evidence of this. Did a 19th century prisoner wandering the corridors of the penitentiary perpetrate the crime from beyond the grave? In 2013, villagers in Thailand's Tambon Tha Sawang were tormented by the ghost of a widow who was thought to have murdered 10 men in a single month. All of the men had died in unexplained circumstances, some while sleeping and others while presumably strolling around. Doctors declared that all had died of respiratory failure. Because none of the men had displayed any signs of illness, the townspeople engaged a spirit medium, who blamed the deaths on a widow ghost. The medium then advised each inhabitant to hang red shirts outside their homes to ward off the spirit, especially those who only had one son, as they were most vulnerable to a ghostly visit. While the mysterious fatalities in Tambon Tha Sawang may have ended there, a different Thai area was harassed in the same way in 2018. Was that the same spectral widow? This narrative begins in 1938 in Kentucky, when a man called Carl Pruitt returned home one day to find his wife in the arms of another man. In a fit of rage, he strangled her to death with a chain before committing suicide. The other man ran away. Visitors at the graveyard spotted discoloration on Pruitt's tombstone after he was buried, and it looked hauntingly similar to a chain. Soon after, a boy attempting to impress his pals chipped the tombstone with a rock and was promptly killed by a bizarre accident. His bicycle chain broke off and strangled him as he rode home. Naturally upset, the boy's mother chose to express her rage on the gravestone, violently smashing it with an axe. She, too, became a victim of the Pruitt Graves curse the next day. She was strangled by her own clothesline, which had wrapped around her neck when she was hanging laundry. Not long after that, another incident occurred that confirmed the Graves' reputation for being cursed. While going by the graveyard in his cart, a farmer discharged a rifle at the tombstone. Fearful of the gunshot, the horses accelerated, and the farmer was thrown from the wagon. One of the reins twisted around his neck and choked him as he fell. The number of strangulations related to the grave was beginning to look like more than a coincidence by this point. But that didn't stop two cops from tempting fate by attempting to take photos of themselves at the graveside. They spotted a brilliant light following them as they drove away from the cemetery. As they rushed away, the vehicle collided with a fence, killing one of the cops, his skull nearly cut by the chain that hung between the fence posts. People avoided the cemetery for years, fearful of meeting a horrific death. But in the 1940s, one man decided to take the risk of hitting the tombstone with a hammer. He was later discovered dead at the cemetery gates. How did he pass away? He was strangled by the chain that shut the cemetery gates, as you might expect. It's no surprise that the cemetery was soon dismantled and the cursed tombstone was permanently removed. Coroners and juries in 19th century England depended on witness testimony in court to identify the cause of death in cases where the deceased was thought to have died of unnatural causes. An inquest was held in Bristol in 1841 into the death of Patrick Hayes, an aged laborer who had fallen down the stairs and died. Mary Croker, the wife of the landlord of the inn where he died, testified that she heard the deceased as he slid down the steps. She yelled out, "Who fell?" It was answered in the deceased's voice, "It is me, and I am dead." Mary Croker told the coroner on oath that the guy had obviously seen the house's resident ghost, a lady in a silk gown who had already killed 2 or 3 of her past lodgers by scaring them to death. A woman named Hannah Rallinson died from terror in mid-19th century Sheffield, South Yorkshire, UK. Rallinson and her husband, both Mormons, had recently moved into new Sheffield housing and had met a woman named Harriet Ward. Harriet was going down into the cellar of the Rallisons' house one day when she shrieked, claiming to see the ghost of a frightening, blood-stained old woman. Harriet didn't simply see the apparition once. It appeared to her 5 times in the following 24 hours, both while she was asleep and awake. The Mormon congregation grew infatuated with the Campo Lane ghost and collectively concluded that it was the victim of a crime who had been buried beneath the cellar floor. It was decided that flagstones should be removed to discover what was beneath. As the night progressed, a large crowd gathered to watch the events, and it was decided to cover the cellar's window to prevent the throng from peering in. Hannah Rallinson went down to the cellar, and what she saw on the cellar steps sent her into a coma. According to the local newspaper, she saw a figure in white rush at her before disappearing. Hannah was carried to another room on the first floor, where her friends attempted to resuscitate her. When she momentarily regained consciousness, she declared that she could still see the ghost, replete with gashes around its neck and a blood-stained nightgown. The ghost had apparently told her it was Elizabeth Johnson, a restless spirit who had been murdered by her nephew, William Dawson, over a century before. Mrs. Johnson, the late, had told her that she had to leave the house since it was stained with her blood. Hannah Rallinson died the next day despite being a fit, healthy, and robust lady, with her death certificate officially noting the cause of death as sudden death in a fit believed to have been brought on by fright. Jane Halsall, a 7-year-old girl from Lancashire, England, purportedly died at the hands of a ghost known as Spring-Heeled Jack, is another tragic story from the 19th century. Spring-Heeled Jack stories had circulated for several decades prior to Jane Halsall's tragic death, and fear of this scary character had not diminished over the years. When Jane went home one day, she told her parents that her playmates had warned her that Spring-Heeled Jack was on his way to her hometown. However, Jane became critically ill that night and was unconscious by the time the doctor arrived. She was quoted as saying just 6 hours before her unexpected demise, "The ghost is coming." The coroner determined that she died of shock and blamed Spring-Heeled Jack, or rather the guy he thought was imitating the evil spirit. A coroner's court jury ruled Jack guilty of the small girl's death, implying that a ghost was tried and convicted in a court of law. The Hinterkaifeck farm looked an improbable location for one of the 20th century's most perplexing murders, with its beautiful Bavarian surroundings. However, in 1922, this homestead was the site for a crime that would perplex German cops and go unsolved. The Grubers were social outcasts, with the husband a notorious wife-beater who had an incestuous relationship with his daughter. Nonetheless, the events that unfolded on the Grubers' farm stunned the surrounding community. Maria, the Grubers' maid, reported hearing disembodied footsteps and voices around the house in late 1921. She resigned unexpectedly, fearing the farm was haunted. Andreas, Maria's father, discovered footsteps in the heavy snow surrounding the home coming from the woods to the farm 6 months after Maria's departure. There were no traces of a return journey. Andreas went on the hunt right away, but no one was located. Andreas heard unusual noises in the attic that night. He discovered nothing and no one in hiding. After that, things took an even stranger turn. The next morning, there was an unfamiliar newspaper on the doorstep. One of the house keys vanished a few days later. Andreas noticed marks on the tool shed lock, as if someone had attempted to pick it. The townspeople began to worry where the Grubers had gone after a few days. They went to the farm to check on the family and discovered a terrible discovery in the barn. The bleeding bodies of 4 family members, stacked one on top of the other and covered with hay. The remainder of the family and the substitute maid were also discovered dead in the residence. Despite traces of strangling, the object suspected to have killed them was a pickaxe. There were also a number of complicated circumstances. Every one of the victims had been hidden in some fashion, and while their dates of death were discovered to be March 31st, neighbors had noticed smoke coming from the farm's chimney after that date. There was indications that meals had recently been consumed, a bed had been slept in, and the farm's animals had been fed in the house. There was no indication of theft, and the jewelry and coins in the house remained untouched. Was the Grubers slain by a vengeful spirit? Was this a heinous home invasion? Whatever the truth is, the killings have yet to be solved and the jury is still out. If you enjoy watching these short stories, why not stick around for the next one? Coming up after this. The Jameson family vanished from the face of the earth in 2009. Their bodies weren't discovered for another 4 years, when their skeleton remains were recovered face down in the woods near where their abandoned truck was located in 2009. Before they vanished, the Jamesons told anybody who would listen that spirits haunted them, and that Madison, their 6-year-old daughter, had regular conversations with a ghost girl who died in their house decades before. Security camera footage shows the family packing their vehicle on the day they vanished, almost as if in a trance. There was no cause of death found, and some speculated that the family members were possessed by the ghosts who haunted their home. Because the bodies were extensively decomposed, it was impossible to determine what killed the Jamesons, therefore speculation continues. These are just 10 documented deaths associated with ghosts. While the reality remains a mystery, we do know that these folks died in unusual circumstances. Who knows what actually occurred?